So first of all, let's go to the basics. What is the New York Times claiming against OpenAI and Microsoft?
It's a familiar claim that has been made by a lot of other publishers that OpenAI has taken the New York Times data, all of their articles, all of their opinions, and has used them to train their generative AI models without getting permission from the New York Times. So New York Times is claiming copyright infringement.
So an ordinary claim in that sense, we're told that OpenAI is a very different sort of creature. Does it fit into typical traditional rubric of copyright?
It really does force us to have to extend intellectual property law as we know it today, because what's happening with the New York Times data is that it's not as if OpenAI is replicating it and trying to profit off of it. It's being fed into this massive neural network, and this neural network is learning how to write new articles, ostensibly in the style of the New York Times. And so it's generating new works using these existing works. So in many ways, like many other cases that we've seen over 2023, it looks like we're in uncharted territory legally in terms of, like, sort of whose side the courts are going to fall on.
But this gets to this whole idea of fair use of certain things that are out there in the public sphere, and the idea of whether you're taking something and, I guess, essentially just creating your own product without really doing anything novel or different than what the source did to actually create that data or that article or whatever we're talking about.
Yep, I mean, this came up when Google created Google Books.
Right.
I think a lot of people said, well, you're just digitizing the books and putting them online. And Google's argument was, well, no, this is a transformative use. It's creating a completely new product that is going to add value to the existing book, because we're not putting the entire book online.
Yeah.
So more people might go out and buy the book.
Yeah, but as we know in practice, that's not really how it worked. I mean, most of us were able to go look at a book on the Google Books page, and without ever having to pay the publisher or the author or anything else. Maybe we only wanted one chapter to pass your course or something, and that was good enough for us.
But you did buy my book, right?
So I'm going to get right after the show.
Over here, I think it's a little more complicated than that, because OpenAI is not giving you excerpts of New York Times articles. This is not what the New York Times is worried about. What they're worried about is that it creates an AI system that can write with the same style and quality as the New York Times, which may be one of the facets that people value in the New York Times and pay their subscription for. And so this really takes us into a place where there's a lot of risk in the system. OpenAI and other large language model companies like it, Google, Meta, are facing what I think is unprecedented regulatory risk, because there are probably going to be hundreds more of these copyright infringement lawsuits over 2024 and 2025, and their ability to innovate and keep innovating depends heavily on being able to continue to do what they've been doing. Plus, the data is already in their existing models. And so, if the remedy is that somehow the data has to be taken out of the models, this actually, introduces a tremendous amount of risk to the business model. I think the risk from the New York Times point of view is, hey, there's going to be a system that starts to compete with us. And there's a broader societal risk here as well, which is that we are in an era where AI systems can replicate the individual style of a person. Someone can create a system that writes like me, that speaks like David or speaks like you, Romaine. And there are right to publicity laws that protect us against those things, but for a lot of people, they're not going to be accessible. And so it leads us into this fascinating new area where you're saying, what are the boundaries around what a human being owns about their style or their creative process?
You mentioned style 3 or 4 times. I'm curious about that, because back when I knew a little bit about copyright, you can't copyright a fact. That's not copyrightable. You can copyright the expression surrounding a fact. Is style more like expression, or is it more like the fact?
Well, if you look at the current law, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, but what I know about intellectual property law, I think the majority view is that artistic style is not protected. And so if you make a certain kind of music, or if you write in a particular style, that is not protected by copyright law. What is protected are the specific instances of expression of that style, like specific works that you generate. And this seemed like a reasonable trade-off when the Copyright Act was passed, because nobody imagined that there might be a system that replicates your individual style. I think the lawmakers were thinking instead of, if someone creates the first hip-hop song, you don't want that person to own all of hip-hop. You want other people to be able to innovate.
So as an economist, not as a lawyer, as an economist, is this potentially an existential risk to the New York Times? I mean, are we looking at a possible world in which I no longer subscribe to the New York Times online or otherwise because I can get the style out of ChatGPT?
Well, I think that if that point comes, it's a little bit in the future. I don't see it as an existential threat to the New York Times in the near term. What could happen is that another news organization might start that isn't the New York Times, but is able to subscribe to a service that gives them the ability to get articles written in the style of the New York Times. It may be insidious. We may not even know why we're attracted to this new news organization, or the style of The Economist that I know that you like, David. And so, the immediate risk is perhaps not great, especially to the New York Times that has built such a powerful brand. But I think that there is a tremendous risk to other news organizations that have less market power in the near term, because the ability of AI to create, sort of human-like writing has sort of hit that critical point.
I am curious, though. I mean, we're kind of really going down the rabbit hole here, but if this gets to the point where they take so much of the style and the essence of what the Times does or other big publications, won't those publications at some point probably be hobbled from a business and financial perspective to the point where they're not producing that style, that content anymore, at the detriment of some of these AI models that are still relying on those same organizations to feed into their system?
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, Romaine, because I think if you look at the long-run economic problem, it's what's the optimal mix of human-generated and AI-generated content that we need so that the AI models continue to innovate. There's been some really interesting research recently that shows that if you train an AI system on purely AI-generated content, it generates pretty mundane content. It doesn't sort of get to the extremes. The tails in the statistical sense are suppressed, and it's generating everything from the head of the distribution. And so eventually this may be the touchstone that lawmakers end up coming back to. They accept the reality that there's going to be a whole bunch of AI-generated content in the world, and they rewrite copyright law to come up with the optimal balance between human-generated and AI-generated content.